Can't tell you how delighted I am that Andrew Crowe has agreed to talk to us today. I was given this book about 6 months ago, and as you get older, you find that it's very hard to change your opinions about life and about how you understand how things work and so on. This book very definitely changed my perception of the world, my place in it, people's place in it. There's so many profound thoughts in it. I shouldn't really just be spruiking books here, but if you get the opportunity, please read this book and please enjoy Andrew's talk today. Thank you.
So I've just come from the Coromandel to give this talk, and I want to say this is the 250th anniversary of Cook's arrival here, as you know, and it's called 250 for a reason. Perhaps you've wondered why, because it's why it's not just about Cook this time. So tuia means to weave or bind together, and comes from a Maori proverb and ritual chant referring to the threads that link people with the cosmos, with the wider natural world. So it's an invitation to spread our vision wide, which I'm doing here. So I'm moving out from birds a bit. We talked at the beginning about the link between people and birds and Maori in particular. And this is a theme for this talk. At school, I hated history. It was all about memorizing dates and names, and it seemed irrelevant to me. I've come to understand the truth of this quote only through writing about the bonds between people and the natural world. This helped me to see why some celebrate Cook and some don't. I know you came here to hear about birds, but I hope to provide some human context too, and maybe shed some light on why Cook has been effectively been asked to take a back seat this time. The use of birds to find land has a venerable history. In the Middle East, the concept can be traced back more than 4,000 years through creation myth that refers to Noah's Ark, the flood, and the return of his dove with an olive branch. Likewise, in the Western Pacific, the creation myths of Samoa refer to Lupe and Tuli, surveying the ocean in search of dry land, a concept that presumably dates back some 3,000 years to when these islands were first discovered by people. In Samoa, the creator god Tagaloa is said to have sent his daughter, Sina, down from heaven in the form of a pigeon to locate the first dry earth. She visited the earth time and again until she finally discovered a rock rising from the crashing waves of the ocean. Lupe here refers to the Pacific imperial pigeon, which does indeed fly between the islands of the Western Pacific in search of seasonal abundances of fruit. Those islands are shown in green on this map and correspond to the route by which West Polynesia is believed to have been settled. In another Samoan tradition, it was Tuli, a son of Tagaloa, who flew down from the heavens and surveyed the surface of the earth, looking for land. And in the southern spring, around September, this shorebird does indeed seek out Pacific islands on returning from its breeding grounds in the Arctic tundra, along routes that are shown in purple on this globe. A potential aid to navigators searching at this time of year for new islands or to help relocate familiar ones. Given that I was not drawn to history at school, you may be wondering what brought me to take an interest in these things. I can trace this back to a visit to the Hawaiian Islands in 1986 when I pointed out the top plant and asked its name. Ia, I was told. That was when I realized just how intimately the islands of Hawaii and Aotearoa, New Zealand are linked. I was familiar with the kia of New Zealand Maori and knew that a K in Maori is equivalent to a glottal stop in Hawaiian. Kia, ia. And yet, as you probably know, there's a big distance between the two places without a lot in between. Just 7,500 kilometers of ocean. Wow, there's a story here. Here is a selection of authoritative New Zealand history books. All portray Polynesian seafarers as desperate and lucky, rather than as explorers with the navigational skill to return and report their finds. This scenario remains entrenched as a mainstream view in New Zealand society today. In a recent and highly acclaimed example, Tangata Whenua, Polynesian voyaging is presented as a reckless act of last resort, with large voyaging canoes fully laden with crew and the accoutrements of settlement, just setting off into the unknown with no prior exploration. This, in my view, is robbing Māori of their true heritage, for it effectively eschews. I have to find out how to read this. I've lost my place. Okay. Eschews any need for long distance navigation. Sorry, I have to read this. I'm not very confident with public speaking. Let me introduce Annie Zhao Black. Here she is seen navigating Hinemoana, the waka just outside. A sailing waka that you'll hear more about shortly. In 2012, when two traditional style sailing wakas set off from New Zealand without navigational instruments in the direction of Easter Island, she was one of the crew. The following year, both waka returned from that island to New Zealand via Tahiti and Rarotonga. In 1938, when Polynesians were still being portrayed as descendants of castaways who simply got lost while fishing, Te Rangihiroa, Sir Peter Buck, introduced their voyaging achievements to the world. In his book, Vikings of the Sunrise, which was based largely on oral evidence, he claimed that by surpassing the achievements of the Phoenicians in the Mediterranean and the Vikings of the North Atlantic, Polynesians are worthy of being called the supreme navigators of history. So in what way did Polynesians surpass the achievements of others? The most obvious concerns their ability to locate and settle tiny targets. For example, Easter Island, which is only half the size of Great Barrier Island, yet as distant from its nearest neighbour as Mexico is from Canada. To locate this island from Mangareva, the island from which it was evidently settled, the target arc is just 0.35 degrees. As a navigational target, this is minuscule. The Vikings had it far easier. Both Greenland and North America present huge targets that were virtually unmissable, as shown on the globe here. The Pacific covers a huge area, about 1/3 of the whole planet. It is so large that all the land on Earth, every single continent, can be fitted into it. Now that alone is interesting when we live on the edge of it, and I don't think many people realize just how big it is. And yet almost all of it was settled by Polynesians. Just ignore the tiny print around the edge of the globe. The important thing here is those red and green dots on the globe itself. These represent islands or archipelagos settled by Polynesians. Red is where a Polynesian language was recorded, and green denotes islands or island groups occupied by them, but subsequently abandoned by the time Europeans arrived. From this we can see that Polynesians had actually found almost every scrap of habitable land within it, from Kapingamarangi over near Papua New Guinea in the west to Easter Island of South America, from Hawaii in the north down to New Zealand. As Captain Cook himself put it, this is certainly by far the most extensive nation upon Earth. It's funny, we don't seem to hear about that. Here, there is no need to distinguish all the arrows. The point is simply to appreciate that they represent a veritable tangle of maritime traffic. Each arrow records an archaeologically attestable voyage. A grey arrow represents a transfer of basalt for making adzes. Black is obsidian, green for greenstone, brown for pottery or clay, red for imported red feathers worn ceremonially as headdresses or in clothing. Together, these material transfers provide hard evidence that Polynesians were not simply drifting into the unknown. Polynesians also made contact with South America. Here we see the spread of kumara in the Pacific, a vegetable whose origin has been genetically traced to Ecuador, where it was traditionally known as kumar. No pre-Polynesian evidence of this plant has yet been found in the Pacific, and yet kumara is known to have reached New Zealand, Easter Island, and Hawaii before the arrival of Europeans. Who carried it? Some have suggested that Native Americans must have been responsible, but neglect to offer any credible motive for them to head so far downwind into an unknown sea. Polynesians, on the other hand, knew the need of a drought-tolerant tuber and the location of the islands. Their likely routes of departure for South America, shown here with dotted pink lines, are based on prevailing winds. To appreciate the true scale of all this, the first transfer from Ecuador to the Marquesas involved a voyage of 6,500 kilometers. There's nothing on the way. This voyage alone is likely to have taken at least 1 month. All this was happening some 750 years ago. As for Europeans, no one would attempt an open sea voyage on this scale for another 250 years. Europeans would launch 48 expeditions in the Pacific over the next 250 years, all before Cook came on the scene. That's 48 before Cook. Even after the first 10 of these expeditions and 50 years of looking, this ocean still seemed empty to Europeans. Not one of these expeditions encountered an islander living anywhere in this vast ocean. Discoveries subsequently made were largely accidental, a byproduct of searching for trade routes and later for a mythical continent in the south that Europeans thought must exist to serve as a counterbalance to Europe in the north. It is ironic then that Europeans would later dismiss discoveries made by Polynesians as accidental. European explorers relied heavily on the use of 3 navigational instruments: the compass, the sextant, and a clock. Armed with these, they were able to draw maps and use them to document and share their accidental discoveries and continue to search uncharted seas in a more methodical way. So how had Polynesians been able to find so much and keep track of their discoveries? The evidence suggests that the answer lies in their close observation of nature and phenomenal powers of memory reinforced through traditional voyaging chants. Even so, the art of non-instrument navigation still took a lifetime to learn. One Samoan wayfinder describes an apprenticeship of over 20 years, spending a great deal of time at sea alone in a small canoe until, as he says, the mind is filled with the sea as the body is filled with blood. Tahitian wayfinder describes how he learned to follow the rise and fall of his vessel with his breath until he could breathe with his feet and see with the heart. On a clear night at least, navigators could hold a course with the stars. Europeans were still puzzled though, for the stars track across the sky through the night just as the sun does during the day. At what point does one follow the star? The method hardly seemed very reliable. However, Pacific navigators had observed that the point on the horizon at which each star rises or sets is fixed. So, they committed to memory a series of rising and setting stars. Here we see the example of Vega and Altair, shortly after they have appeared on the eastern horizon, straddling the compass point of east-northeast. So coming to New Zealand from Rarotonga, then you would keep that point at the stern. The best friend of the traditional navigator, it seems, is the ocean swell. This refers to a specific type of wave seen here that is generated from a distant source. These are relatively constant, rise and fall slowly, are smooth and rounded, and have a long interval between crests. This distinguishes them from the local wind waves, which tend to be temporary, shorter and steeper, and have breaking crests. Wave patterns may be set up by several systems, or moving across one another in different directions, each differing in height, length, shape, and speed, and yet the navigator can still distinguish the swell. Oops, I've got the wrong button. Sorry. In the South Pacific, this refers to a swell generated by strong westerlies at latitudes south of the South Island. Surprisingly, the impact of this strong southern swell can frequently be seen and felt as far north as the equator. The navigator is as familiar with how he is cutting through this type of swell as a carver knows the grain of his wood. With the feel of this alone, he can hold his course even in sleep. And I don't know how many sailors are here, but I imagine most of you have experienced how a slight deviation on course in your sleep, you pick it up, you feel the boat moving differently. So far we've discussed maintaining a course. To establish location, other indicators are used, for example current boundaries. The photo shows a line of flotsam, Thargassum seaweed, which here marks a meeting of such currents, a phenomenon that occurs in specific locations shown in pink on this map of Pacific currents. A navigator is called to use all his senses. Once trained, he distinguishes local currents through subtle changes in the colour of the water or its taste, or dips his arm into the sea to test for cool flows. In the early 1980s, Scottish navigator James Barr noticed Captain Moy of Samoa tasting the water repeatedly as an aid to wayfinding. "I have no idea how it's possible to navigate by these means," he added. "I tried it, you could only taste brine." And yet regional variations in the temperature and salinity of the top 1 to 2 centimetres of the world's oceans are sufficiently distinctive that they can be readily picked up from space, as depicted on the accompanying NASA satellite maps. So the top one is salinity and ocean temperature below. So salinity varies according to freshwater sources. So as you go towards the pole, melting ice, as you come to a continent, there will be more rivers, so the water becomes less saline. So this is the kind of thing you're picking up. On approach to land, there is often an increase in the number of flying insects landing on the sails and rigging. In the water, there's a noticeable increase in the quantity of floating leaves, driftwood, and seaweed. And Europeans were noticing the same thing before they had the modern techniques of navigation. They were picking up the same things. Captain Cook and so on, they referred to the same things. But this was much more refined, this ability is much more refined amongst Pacific wayfinders because they had no other means. High islands such as Tahiti or Aotearoa, New Zealand, often have a cap of stationary white clouds sitting over them. Such clouds may be seen from up to 180 kilometres away, well before the land itself becomes visible. The turquoise lagoons of certain atolls such as Anaa in the Tuamotus, shown in the inset here, can be of such an intense colour that their presence may be picked up and distinguished from as much as 70 kilometres away, simply from the sunlight that reflects this hue up onto the underside of clouds sitting over them. And I've talked to fishermen who can see this, who live in that area. The swell and local wind waves also betray the presence of land, with subtle bounce-back waves and other interference patterns. These wave signatures are sufficiently distinctive that when a trainee navigator is left to float bodily on different sides of an atoll, they learn to distinguish position in relation to the atoll by feel alone. So that's a bit similar to what I was saying about when you're sailing and you can feel the movement of the boat and you wake up. They're feeling this, they learn to do it by feel alone. Then they can see, like what you're looking at here is an image. They can also perceive it by looking at the water, but they can also feel these differences. So when sailing, they're able to maintain this ability even in semi-conscious states of sleep. But now you may be wondering whether I've forgotten about birds, but I'm coming to that. Nearing land, the bird life tends to increase, as does the number of fish. Differing species of both also begin to appear. To a navigator in the tropics, the most important birds to look out for are fairy tern, brown booby, and black noddy. All return to land at night to rest. Their direction of flight is naturally more significant at dawn and dusk, and when seen carrying fish home in their beaks. Now in this picture you can see a typical atoll. You can see it's very low lying. You don't see atolls. If you've ever been sailing in those in the areas in the tropics where there's atolls, you find that you can't see till you've almost on them. You have to get very close before you can see them. You're totally dependent on the height of the coconut to get a sense of where they are. And I've sailed in these areas and I've seen these birds increase as you get closer, so that you know that you're to keep an eye out. You're getting close now, and you do pay attention to the birds, unless you have sat-navs, in which case you don't need to. Birds will sometimes be carried aboard the canoes too, for release. Several could be trusted to either find land or return to the canoe. These include frigate birds, rails, plovers, red-tailed tropic birds, herons, and sooty terns. At least 2 traditional Polynesian sea shanties honour this practice. We hear, for example, how frigate birds would take their rightful place poised upon the towering prow as the eyes of the navigator. All these indicators, flotsam, clouds, wave patterns, and local birds, each one of these is potentially helpful when nearing land, but the Pacific is huge, about 1/3 of the whole planet, as we said, and largely empty. Without any clues, it would be like looking for a needle in a haystack. Where to start? The speed and success of Polynesian settlement suggests acumen and acute observation to help narrow the search. Sooty terns breed in dense communities on predator-free islets and atolls. They continue to forage from here for up to 480 kilometres or more, becoming increasingly evident within 40 to 80 kilometres of the colony. To give some idea of scale, on Kiritimati Island and the Line Islands, the number of sooty terns recorded nesting at any one time is in the order of 15 million. That's probably not current figures, probably a lot lower than that now. This was from the 1960s. In season, sightings of birds carrying fish undoubtedly help guide voyagers to islands to the extent that their pride of place in wayfinding is immortalized in these lines of a traditional voyaging towns. The black tern. The black tern is my bird, bird in whom my eyes are gifted with unbounded vision. Here's a good example. In this photo, we are looking out across a Birdman stone carving on Easter Island to the offshore islet of Motunui. That's the one, the red arrow. Until the spring of 1867, competitors would swim out to this islet to retrieve the first sooty tern egg of the season. The bird's navigational role suggests that the island's connection with the rest of Polynesia originally depended to a large extent on its seasonal return to the island. Indeed, this may be the original basis of the Birdman cult rituals that were previously practiced here. This clip shows a sooty tern colony in the Indian Ocean, but is typical of such colonies in the Pacific. For much of the year, these birds are away roaming the ocean, but in spring they make their way back to these colonies. I adjust the volume on this? Somebody help me with this? Oh, it's fading out now. It's okay. But I think we need a slightly lower volume for the sound on this. Anyway, I can talk. Here we are on the same island, looking up now. Such impressive scenes may well have been a lot more common on remote islands before the first people and rats colonized them. A fact to bear in mind when assessing the likely role of these birds in the original exploration phase of the Pacific by Polynesians. Seabird flocks encountered far out to sea can sometimes be equally impressive. Here we see a flock of sooty shearwaters that were mentioned earlier in Chris's talk. Migratory flocks of which may number as many as 500,000 birds. The overall phenomenon is more impressive still, for in early October, some 20 million of these birds are heading southwest across the equator from their feeding grounds in the North Pacific to nesting sites in and around New Zealand. Although these breeding sites are nowadays confined to offshore islets, subfossil evidence reveals that colonies previously extended onto the mainland, which was then rat-free. Here again, we can assume that the present total offers no more than a hint of the original spectacle witnessed by the first Polynesians. And talking to seabird researchers, when I said yesterday that maybe it was 10 times as many at that time, they said, yeah, quite possibly that many. So you'll see in this following clip just a small number of birds coming to New Zealand. This clip shows the migration route of the city shearwaters, what it looks like in spring when they're heading to New Zealand. There's nothing artificial about this clip. It's not looped to repeat a brief sequence. It's just a tiny glimpse of a global spectacle. The birds are very easy to see as they fly low to the waves, as most of you probably know, and that's why they're called shearwaters. These so-called mutton birds were and are important food for Polynesians. Subfossil evidence confirms this. The chicks nest in burrows, so are very easy to harvest. The seasonal movement of such birds would have been closely monitored right across the Pacific. Red dots on the globe show the region over which the indigenous term for these birds, titi, is shared, implying a region over which such information is likely to be shared. Now that's one of the themes in this book here is language, so we're looking at some of these links between different places. So we can see that lilac area on the globe, that's East Polynesia. So we see here, just in language, one link, one of the many links between New Zealand and East Polynesia specifically. The birds themselves have a huge range, as you saw earlier in with Chris's presentation. In the course of a single year, they will go on to trace a giant figure of 8 across the entire Pacific. Here, bright blue squiggles trace foraging flights made from New Zealand during the nesting season. Yellow shows their routes of autumn departure, and orange denotes their activity in 3 northern Pacific foraging zones before all return along a narrow corridor across the equator toward New Zealand in just 10 days. This involves an average passage of 23 birds per second. So if you think day and night, and this is an average, so there'll be peaks. So it's far busier than the Southern Motorway, and hence quite noticeable. Like some people question whether Polynesians would notice something like this. I think it's pretty obvious. At high latitudes, they're riding on the westerlies, and on the tropical zone, high latitudes means up the top, down the bottom here, in case you're confused with latitudes and longitudes. And in the tropical zone, they take advantage of the easterly trade winds. Polynesian navigators had need of the same winds, so almost certainly noted the timing and route of such massive movements of birds. And that's one of the central themes of why this book is called Pathway of the Birds, because it seems like it's a very obvious link here. This transequatorial transfer of seabirds from north to south involves many more species. This graphic summarizes the phenomenon and is based on satellite data collected from 8 species: Cook's petrel, mottled petrel, black-winged petrel, tatum petrel, pie-cross petrel, gold's petrel, sooty shearwater, flesh-footed shearwater. Likewise, their autumn return to feeding grounds in the north entails another massive transfer, but along quite different routes, reflecting a seasonal change in global winds. Here again, offering potentially valuable information to a Polynesian navigator. Now, is Matt Rayner here by any chance?
No.
Because he provided a lot of the data here, so helped a lot with this. The New Zealand region is indeed a global hotspot for seabirds, which we just heard from Chris about this, with a quarter of all seabird species on the planet continuing to nest here. The total number of birds on the move in the 13th century, before the arrival of humans and their introduced pests, was undoubtedly even more impressive. And that's something that I keep going back to again and again, that what Polynesians experienced was quite different from what we see today. By Polynesians, I mean the ancestors of Maori. Zooming in on New Zealand now, we can be quite specific about where the hottest hotspots are. So that graphic here on the left, that represents seabird sightings from fishing vessels. And the darker the colour, the more birds are being noticed. So note the region of high seabird density along the Chatham Rise, that horizontal orange band stretching east from Christchurch on the South Island, and another region of high density further south around the subantarctic islands. I would suggest that such localised hives of activity contributed to the Polynesian discovery of the more remote Chatham Islands and Enderby Island. These photos of the New Zealand long-tailed cuckoo were taken in the tropical Pacific during the bird's annual winter visits there to islands and atolls scattered over a wide region there. And for me, it was very exciting to see these birds in the tropics, to go to an atoll and see a bird that has flown all the way from New Zealand, especially a land bird that can't land on the water on the way. The tropical range of this bird is extraordinary, and yet it nests only in New Zealand. On this map, red dots identify the many islands that receive regular winter visits from this bird. As a forest bird, its seasonal arrivals and departures from the islands were undoubtedly observed and understood for what they were, signposts to a forested land elsewhere. We know that Polynesians communicated with one another about this bird over a vast area, from a linguistic region identified on this map by a wavy green line, over which a single Polynesian term is recorded for it. This region extends from the Caroline Islands in the west to the Marquesas in the east. So that's a span of around 7,500 kilometres, over which people are using the same word for the same bird, so they obviously are recognising that this is the same bird they're talking about. And it nests only here. I know it's not a seabird, it's okay. There is at least one traditional Polynesian voyaging chant that refers to the following of such birds, because people often say, well, how do you know that they've followed birds? Well, there's a voyaging chant. The structured form of such chants tends to resist accidental alteration, which makes them relatively reliable sources of historical information. Here are a few pertinent lines from it, lines that also inspired the title of a recent book of mine on this topic. So I'm sure you can read it, but I'll read it out anyway. Mine is the migrating bird, flying on even beating wings to lands revisited, ever searching out the road of the ocean. It is the road of the winds coursed by sea kings to unknown lands. Mine is the bird. So here the book's being launched. It was launched last year aboard the Waka that's outside. Twin-hull sailing Waka featured on the book's cover. Why? Because Katikati entrepreneur Simon MacDonald reports that it was a draft of this book that inspired him to purchase this Waka and fund its present use, to take young people out on development voyages. Here he explains, I thought, wow, what an astonishing feat that the Polynesians travelled across vast oceans to get to these islands. It's an astounding achievement 800 years ago, and it is a mind-boggling thing. A work colleague had just asked him to sponsor her daughter to go on. I pressed the wrong button again. He'll come back. Work colleague had just asked him to sponsor her daughter to go on the Spirit of Adventure. So he says, I put the two ideas together and thought, wouldn't it be cool? Now, I want to tell you a little bit more here because when I had a lot of struggle with this book. It took 15 years and got a lot of rejections, and I was showing the draft to different people, getting feedback, and this Simon, he was reading chapter by chapter. So one time he wrote to me, he says, oh, yeah, he wanted to buy this Waka. I want to spend $2 to $3 million. So that gave me some encouragement. So here's the book. It took 15 years to write. It involves sailing from the Marquesas to Tahiti and was turned down by most New Zealand publishers. In the end, it was published simultaneously by David Bateman in New Zealand and University of Hawaii Press in the USA. I'm happy to report that it's recently been received a History Board Best New Zealand History Book of the Year. So to sum up, I have every admiration for Captain Cook, but it is Polynesians who settled the largest nation on earth. More than 750 years ago, some 500 years before him. And seabears undoubtedly helped him to do that. To conclude, I would like to close with a song and hope that you'll join me. It's a well-known Māori song that speaks of love, faith and peace for all people, and it's called Te Aroha. Te Aroha, Te Thank you. There's a little video of Hine Moana as well. Yeah.
Andrew,
Yeah.
you'll be pleased to know that through the clue here.
Oh, wonderful.
Hine Moana, one right here.
Ah.
You can't get out.
Andrew, thank you. The story you tell is an absolutely extraordinary one, and you tell it exceptionally well, both in words, on the page, and in the pictures that you provide. On behalf of everyone here, thank you very, very much for sharing it with us today.